the two most common mistakes I see with epidemiology in the internet discourse are one, giving it too much weight, and two, not giving it enough. And we see these all the time. And interestingly, a lot of times the same person is making both, just on different days. So we see this all the time. People, an inconvenient epidemiological study is dismissed because epidemiology is weak. And then a week later, an epidemiological study that supports the belief is touted because it supports the belief, right? So we want to be very careful. It's a natural human tendency. We all have that bug in us to favor the data we like, but we have to be very careful with that and try to be as consistent as possible with the heuristics. So why don't we just dismiss epidemiology? Because there are questions that you can't ask with randomized controlled trials. You can't ask if smoking leads to lung cancer over 30 or 40 years with a randomized controlled trial, because you can't randomize people to smoke and then follow them for 30 years. It's just not doable, right? And trans fats, another example that also comes from epidemiology. There are many findings, trans fats and cardiovascular disease, right? That connection. There are many findings and many things that we not take for granted as causal even, that either started with epidemiology or to this day are largely rooted in epidemiological findings. So they're complementary because the general idea on the internet, in certain circles of the internet, is that epidemiology is useless and randomized controlled trials are this perfect experiment framed in gold and, in the Hall of Fame. Both of those are misconceptions. The reality is epidemiology is extremely important and useful, but it has blind spots. So that's why we interpret epidemiology in context of the totality of evidence. You don't do a logical leap from a observational study in the vacuum to, okay, there's causal relationship. That's a mistake. But the same is true about RCTs. They have lots of blind spots and caveats, especially when you get into nutrition, for example. The longer the RCT, the more it looks like an epidemiological study. The more you have to rely on what people tell you they eat, for example. One of the problems that's pointed out, one of the caveats of epidemiology, right? Relying on self-reports, the food frequency questionnaires. Well, when you're looking at a randomized controlled trial that goes on for years, you have to rely on what people tell you they eat. Some exceptions, historical exceptions where people are trapped in a certain place in mental hospitals or something. There are some examples like that. But in general, most RCTs that are not a month or two long, that are longer, you still have to tell people what to eat, but then you have to ask them, are you eating what I told you to eat? And you have to rely on their report. Sometimes there are other mechanisms you can measure serum markers and try to correlate, but you can do that with epidemiology as well. The point is just that no experiment is perfect. And these things cover for each other's blind spots. Just like a randomized controlled trial isn't really doable for 20 years, by and large. The epidemiology covers that. With the RCT, you're typically limited with the sample size. The epidemiology is very good at that. But then the epidemiology has some weaknesses, and that's where the RCT is strongest. So it's like using, you don't use a hammer exclusively to build a house. You use different tools depending on the exact task at hand. Here's the same thing. You look at all of the evidence, and where these different experimental approaches align, where they give you generally an answer in the same direction, that's where our confidence is strongest. That's where we start to think it's a fundamental fact of nutrition or public health or whatever it may be.